The road to Stonefell was long, and the November air that pressed against the carriage window was thin and sharp with the promise of a bitter winter. Eliza Vance felt the cold, not in her bones, but in the pit of her stomach. It was the cold of finality. This was the last place, the last hope. The driver, a man hired in the last town for the final leg of the journey, had said little, but as the carriage rounded a bend, revealing the house for the first time, he let out a low whistle. "There she is," he grunted. "Stonefell." It did not rise so much as it grew from the moorland, a vast, severe edifice of dark grey stone, its multitude of windows like vacant eyes, staring out over the desolate landscape of Northumberland. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a fortress, a monument to endurance, not to joy. Eliza pulled her thin wool cloak tighter, her fingers curling inside her worn leather gloves. The right glove was more worn than the left, the leather softened and strained over the shape of the object it concealed. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel of the drive, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the heavy silence of the estate. They drew to a stop before a set of enormous oak doors, studded with iron. This was the front entrance, the one meant for visitors of consequence. For a moment Eliza allowed herself to imagine being greeted, being welcomed, a foolish, fleeting dream. The driver hauled her small, battered trunk from the back. "This is as far as I go, miss." She paid him the last of her coins, leaving her with nothing. Absolutely nothing. It did not matter. Either she would have a place here, or she would have nothing anywhere. The totality of the risk was, in its own way, calming. She stood alone on the wide stone steps, her trunk beside her, a small, solitary figure in a plain grey travelling dress, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the house. The silence stretched. No one came. Taking a breath that felt as sharp as broken glass, she raised a gloved hand and lifted the heavy iron knocker. The sound it made was a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was the sound of a challenge. After a long wait, the sound of bolts being drawn echoed from within. One of the great doors opened, not fully, but just enough for a man to peer out. He was tall, thin, and dressed in severe black livery. His face was a mask of professional disapproval. "Yes?" The word was clipped, impatient. "I am here to see the Duke of Northwood," Eliza said. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The butler's eyes flickered over her, taking in the cheap fabric of her dress, the scuffed toes of her boots, the weary pallor of her face. It was a swift, dismissive inventory. "The Duke is not receiving petitioners today." "I am not a petitioner," she replied, keeping her voice even. "My name is Eliza Vance. My business with His Grace is private." The butler's expression did not soften. If anything, a colder, more practiced dismissal settled over his features. "His Grace has left explicit instructions. All persons of your station seeking audience are to be directed to the housekeeper's entrance at the rear of the house. Mrs. Croft will determine if your business warrants further attention." He began to close the door. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Your station, the servants' entrance. It was a deliberate, calculated humiliation, a wall erected before she had even crossed the threshold. She could feel the colour drain from her face, replaced by a hot, prickling shame. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend. They bought nothing but pity, and pity was a cage. Instead, a cold, quiet anger settled deep within her. It was the anger of injustice, of being misread, dismissed and discarded without a hearing. She had come here expecting difficulty, but not this cold, casual cruelty at the very door. "I see," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The butler paused, the door held slightly ajar. "Would you be so good as to point me in the direction of the rear of the house?" There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Or perhaps the faintest trace of respect for her lack of protest. "Follow the gravel path to your left. It will lead you around the west wing. You will find the door you seek there." The door closed with a soft, final click. The bolts slid home. Eliza stood motionless for a moment. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face. The house loomed over her, a silent, stony tyrant. She looked at her small trunk, at the grand, closed door, and then down at her gloved hands. She could leave. She could turn around, walk back down the endless drive and disappear. No one would stop her. No one would even know she had been here. But where would she go? Her mother's voice, faint and fragile from her sickbed, echoed in her memory. Go to Stonefell. The Duke will honor his word. He gave me his pledge, Alara. His pledge. Her mother had called her Alara. Eliza was the name she had taken for herself, a plainer, more sensible name for a world that had offered her neither grace nor elegance. The pledge. It was all she had. With a resolve that felt as hard and unyielding as the stone of the house itself, she bent, picked up the handle of her trunk, and began the long, humiliating walk around the West Wing. The gravel crunched under her feet, each step a small surrender. The West Wing was endless, a monotonous facade of grey stone and dark windows. She felt the eyes of the house upon her, unseen but palpable. She was being watched, judged, and found wanting. The path curved, revealing a smaller, plainer courtyard. A well stood in the centre. The air here smelled of coal smoke and boiled laundry. This was the heart of the machine, the place that powered the grand illusion of the front. A simple wooden door, scuffed and paint-peeled, was set into the wall. The servant's entrance. She set down her trunk. Her shoulders ached. Her pride was a raw, open wound. She did not knock this time. She simply reached for the iron latch, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. She found herself in a stone-flagged corridor, dimly lit by a single high window. The air was warm and smelled of beeswax and baking bread. A young maid carrying a basket of linens stopped and stared at her, her eyes wide with curiosity. Before the maid could speak, a woman emerged from a doorway down the hall. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a black dress, a chatelaine of keys jangling at her waist. Her gaze was sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. This had to be Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper. "Can I help you?" The housekeeper's voice was firm, but not unkind. It lacked the butler's icy disdain. "My name is Eliza Vance," Eliza said, forcing herself to meet the woman's gaze. "I was told to come here. I need to speak with the Duke." Mrs. Croft's eyes performed the same swift calculation as the butler's, but her conclusion was different. She saw the exhaustion, yes, and the poverty, but she also seemed to see something else, the straightness of Eliza's spine, the unwavering clarity of her gaze. "The Duke does not conduct his business in the kitchens, Miss Vance," she said, her tone softening slightly. "What is the nature of your visit?" "It is a personal matter," Eliza said. "It concerns a promise made by the late Duke." At the mention of the old Duke, a shadow passed over Mrs. Croft's face, a flicker of grief, quickly suppressed. "Many people believe the late Duke made them promises. His Grace was a man of expansive feeling." "This was different," Eliza insisted quietly. "I have proof." Mrs. Croft studied her for a long moment. "The new Duke, His Grace Alexander, is not like his father. He is a man of order and fact. He does not care for expansive feelings." She sighed, a small, weary sound. "And he has been plagued by claimants since his father's passing. He has grown wary." "I am not a false claimant," Eliza said. The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of her conviction. "Mrs." Croft seemed to hear it. "Very well, wait here." She disappeared back into the room she had come from. Eliza stood in the corridor, the object of intense but silent scrutiny from the kitchen staff who bustled past. She felt like a specimen pinned to a board. She focused on a crack in the stone floor, tracing its path with her eyes. She would not fidget. She would not look away. She would simply stand and wait. Minutes later, Mrs. Croft returned. "His Grace will see you. He's in the small library. Follow me." Eliza picked up her trunk. "Leave that," Mrs. Croft said, not unkindly. "Thomas will see to it. Should you be staying?" The should hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Eliza followed the housekeeper through a labyrinth of corridors. They moved from the stone-flagged world of the servants into the carpeted realm of the family. The air grew cooler, quieter. The smell of bread was replaced by the faint, pleasant scent of old paper and lemon oil. They passed portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with silent disapproval. Finally, Mrs. Croft stopped before a pair of polished mahogany doors. She knocked softly. "Enter!" a voice called from within. It was a deep, controlled voice, accustomed to command. Mrs. Croft opened the door and stood aside. "Miss Vance, Your Grace." Eliza stepped into the room. The small library was still a grand room, lined from floor to ceiling with books. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the rich wood and leather bindings. A man stood with his back to her, staring out the tall window at the bleak expanse of the moors. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in immaculate, severe black. He did not turn. "Mrs. Croft, I trust you have explained the protocols. Any claims for charity or recompense are to be submitted in writing to my man of business." "She was insistent, Your Grace," Mrs. Croft said softly. "She mentioned your father." At that, the Duke turned. His face was what she had expected from his voice. It was a handsome face with a strong jaw and sharp, aristocratic features. But it was a face closed to the world. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of grey, were cold as the winter sky. His mouth was a thin, unforgiving line. This was a man locked in a fortress of his own making. A man drowning in a grief so profound it had frozen him solid. She recognized it instantly. It was a different species of grief from her own, the grief of the powerful rather than the powerless. But it was grief nonetheless. His cold grey eyes swept over her, taking in the same details the butler had, but his assessment was even more brutal. He did not see a woman. He saw a problem, an untidiness, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of his ordered world. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "You have 5 minutes to state your case. I am a busy man." Eliza met his gaze without flinching. "Your Grace, my mother was Eleanor Vance. I believe she was known to your late father." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps recognition, crossed his face. "The name is not unfamiliar. My father had a wide acquaintance." "Their acquaintance was of a particular nature," Eliza said carefully. "Before she passed away, she instructed me to come here. She told me your father had made a promise, a pledge that I would always have a place of safety at Stonefell." The Duke's expression hardened. A place of safety. How very poetic. And what form did you imagine this place of safety would take? A pension? A cottage on the estate? A position in the household? The scorn in his voice was like a physical touch, cold and unwanted. "I imagined only what was promised," she said. "A home." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "A home. Miss Vance, in the year since my father's death, I have received no fewer than 17 such claims. Women appearing from all corners of the kingdom, all armed with sentimental stories of my father's supposed promises. My cousin, Mr. Thorne, has spent a great deal of time and expense exposing them as frauds, each and every one." "I am not a fraud, Your Grace." "So they all say," he countered, his voice like ice. He walked over to his desk, his movements precise and controlled. He picked up a letter opener, turning it over and over in his long fingers. "My father, as Mrs. Croft so delicately put it, was a man of expansive feeling. He was generous to a fault, and his kindness was often mistaken for commitment. He scattered promises like a farmer scatters seed, with little thought to where they might land, or what they might grow into." The casual cruelty of his words, the dismissal of his own father's character, startled her. This was a grief that had curdled into bitterness. "I have proof," she said again, the words feeling thin in the heavy air of the room. "Proof?" He raised an eyebrow. "A lock of his hair? A dried flower from the garden? A tear-stained letter professing undying love? I have seen them all, Miss Vance. They are meaningless." "It is more than that." She held her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her right hand, in its worn glove, ached with the secret it held. He did not ask to see her proof. He simply dismissed the possibility of it. That was what she found most galling. He had already tried and convicted her in his mind. "My cousin Julian has warned me specifically about this," the Duke continued, his voice hardening further. "He spoke of a woman from the south, a Vance who had been making inquiries. He described it as the most audacious attempt yet. A carefully constructed fiction designed to prey on the memory of my father." So there was a name to her enemy. A cousin, Mr. Thorne, a man who had poisoned the well before she had even arrived. "Your cousin is mistaken," Eliza said, "or he is lying." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "You would do well not to insult my family, Miss Vance. Mr. Thorne has been my right hand in settling the chaotic state of my father's affairs. His loyalty is without question." He placed the letter opener down with a sharp click. "I am weary of this. I am weary of these endless grasping hands reaching for a piece of my father's legacy. I will not have my family's name and fortune picked apart by opportunists." He looked at her then, a long, cold look. It was a look designed to make her feel small, insignificant, and utterly defeated. "However," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "I am not an unreasonable man. You have travelled a long way. You are clearly without means." His gaze flickered again to her dress. "I will not turn you out into the cold. Not immediately." A sliver of hope, treacherous and thin, pierced through Eliza's anger. "Mrs. Croft is in need of a companion," the Duke went on, his voice detached, as if he were arranging the placement of a piece of furniture. "An educated woman to read to her in the evenings, to help with the household accounts. It is a respectable position. You would have room and board. It would afford you time to reconsider your story, and for my man of business to make his inquiries." The hope died as quickly as it had been born. It was not an offer of help. It was a sentence. He was offering her a position as a high-ranking servant, a gilded cage. He would keep her here, under his roof, under his control, until he had proven to his own satisfaction that she was a liar. It was a subtler, more refined humiliation than the servant's entrance, but a humiliation nonetheless. She could refuse. She could throw his offer back in his face, declare her pride and walk out. But to where? The cold November wind and the empty road were her only alternatives. And here, at least, she would be inside the fortress. She could watch. She could learn. She could wait for her moment. He thought he was controlling her, but perhaps she could use this position to her own advantage. To be underestimated was its own kind of power. She looked at this cold, grieving Duke, a man so lost in his own pain that he could not see the truth standing right in front of him. She felt a surge of something that was not quite pity, but a kind of weary understanding. "I accept your offer, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. A flicker of surprise in his grey eyes. He had expected her to argue, to protest her station. Her quiet acceptance seemed to disconcert him. "Very well," he said, turning away from her again, a clear dismissal. "Mrs. Croft will show you to your room. She will explain your duties." He walked back to the window, his back once again to her, presenting a wall of black wool and rigid posture. The audience was over. Croft, who had been standing silently by the door, gave Eliza a look that was a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "This way, Miss Vance." Eliza turned and walked out of the library, leaving the Duke alone with the fire and the ghosts of his father's promises. She had not shown him the ring. The moment had not been right. He would not have seen it for what it was. He would have seen it only as another trinket, another part of the fraud. No, she would wait. She would wait until he was ready to see. In the Duke's private study, Alexander Blackwood stood at the window long after the woman had gone. The click of the door closing had echoed in the silent room. He watched her phantom reflection in the dark glass, a slender grey shape against the backdrop of the moors. Miss Vance. He had been prepared for hysterics, for tears, for impassioned speeches. He was not prepared for her quiet, unyielding dignity. She had not flinched. She had not raised her voice. She had met his accusations with a simple, infuriatingly calm denial. And she had accepted his offer of a servant's position without a flicker of protest. It was unsettling. Julian had been so certain. "She's a cunning one, this Vance," he'd written from London. "Her father was a failed merchant, left her with nothing. She's been sniffing around the edges of society for a patron. My sources say she's clever, well-spoken, and utterly ruthless. Don't let her near you, Alex. She'll spin you a tale that would make a bishop weep." He trusted Julian. He had to. Since their father's death, the world had become a treacherous place, full of shifting alliances and hidden motives. His father had ruled his life with booming laughter and careless affection, leaving a wake of emotional and financial chaos. Alexander, his heir, was left to restore order. It was his solemn, joyless duty. Julian, his mother's nephew, had been a rock in the storm, his cynicism a welcome antidote to their father's ruinous sentimentality. And yet, this woman did not feel ruthless. She felt contained, as if she were holding a vast power in reserve. He had seen the way she held herself, the straightness of her spine, the steadiness of her gaze. It was not the posture of a petitioner. It was the posture of someone who believed, with absolute certainty, that she was in the right. And her hands. He had noticed her hands. She wore cheap leather gloves, the right one noticeably more worn than the left. She had not removed them, not even for a moment. Her fingers had remained curled, as if protecting something. What proof had she spoken of? He had been so quick to dismiss it. Perhaps he should have asked. No, it was a trap. A performance. She wanted to pique his curiosity, to draw him into her story. By placing her in the household, under his observation, he held all the power. He could watch her, study her, and wait for the mask to slip. And it would slip. They always did. He ran a hand over his face, the weariness settling deep into his bones. He was so tired of it all. The ledgers that didn't balance, the tenants with their endless complaints, the memory of his father's booming laugh echoing in the empty halls. He had loved his father, but his grief was tangled with a profound, exhausting anger. Anger at the mess he'd been left to clean up. This woman, Miss Vance, was just one more piece of that mess. A final, lingering debt from a man who had spent his life accumulating them. He would let her stay. He would let her read to Mrs. Croft and tally accounts in the housekeeper's sitting room. And he would wait for her to reveal herself as the fraud Julian insisted she was. He would be patient. He was good at patience. It was the one thing his grief had taught him. Eliza's room was in the attic, at the top of a narrow, winding staircase. It was small and sparsely furnished, with a simple iron bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a single dormer window that looked out over the bleak, beautiful moors. It was a servant's room. But it was clean, it was warm, and it was hers. After months of living in cramped boarding houses, sharing rooms with strangers, it felt like a palace. Mrs. Croft stood in the doorway. "It's not grand, but the view is fine on a clear day." "It's more than I could have hoped for, thank you," Eliza said, and she meant it. Mrs. Croft's expression softened. "The Duke. He has been through a great deal. His father's passing was sudden, and the estate was not left in good order. He feels the weight of it all." She was not excusing his behavior, Eliza realized, but explaining it. "Grief makes us into strangers, even to ourselves," Eliza said quietly. The housekeeper looked at her, a new understanding in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "It does." She gestured to the room. "Settle yourself. Dinner is at 6 in my sitting room. We will discuss your duties then." Left alone, Eliza walked to the window. The sun was setting, staining the grey clouds with strokes of lavender and rose. The wind howled softly, a lonely song. She was a prisoner here in a way, but she was also exactly where she needed to be. She finally pulled off her gloves, laying them carefully on the small bedside table. Her hand felt strangely light without the familiar weight. There, on the third finger of her right hand, was the ring. It was a man's signet ring, fashioned from heavy gold, but sized for a woman's hand. The face of it was a smooth, dark onyx, engraved with a crest, a falcon with its wings outstretched, clutching a single oak leaf, the crest of the Dukes of Northwood. It was a perfect, smaller twin of the ring the Duke himself wore, the one she had glimpsed on his finger as he toyed with the letter opener. Her mother had given it to her on her deathbed. "He said it was a part of him," she had whispered, her voice a reedy thread. "He said that as long as this ring existed, his pledge to me would hold, that Stonefell would be a sanctuary for my child. He made me swear never to speak of it unless there was no other choice. It was our secret, a better secret than the one the world might have suspected." Eliza traced the falcon's wings with her fingertip. This was not a token of a frivolous affair. This was a symbol of a deep and abiding bond, a secret kept for a lifetime. Her mother had been a governess in a neighboring estate when she met the old Duke. Their connection had been one of mind and spirit, a quiet, intellectual companionship that had lasted for decades, hidden in plain sight. He had been married, his Duchess a fragile, unhappy woman who lived mostly in London. Her mother had never been his mistress in the conventional sense. She had been his friend, his confidant, his quiet harbour. This ring was the symbol of that unspoken truth. And the new Duke, in his cold, bitter grief, had reduced it all to a sordid transaction. She slipped her glove back on. He was not ready to see this. He was not worthy of the story it told. Not yet. Her duties, as Mrs. Croft explained them over a simple dinner of soup and bread in her cosy sitting room, were straightforward. In the mornings, she was to help with the household ledgers, ordering supplies, checking inventories, tallying expenses. The work was meticulous and suited her ordered mind. In the afternoons, she was free. In the evenings, after dinner, she was to read aloud to the housekeeper for an hour. The first few days passed in a quiet, monotonous rhythm. Eliza kept to her place. She spoke when spoken to. She performed her duties with quiet efficiency. She was polite to the other servants, who treated her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was not one of them, but she was not one of the family either. She existed in a strange, liminal space, a ghost in the machine of the great house. She saw the Duke only fleetingly, a glimpse of his tall figure striding down a corridor, the sound of his horse's hooves in the courtyard. He never acknowledged her. He looked through her as if she were made of glass. He did not see her. He did not truly see her at all. And in his blindness, he gave her the freedom to observe him. She saw the way his shoulders were permanently braced, as if for a blow. She saw the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She saw him in the library one afternoon, standing before a portrait of his father. The old Duke was depicted smiling, a large, handsome man with a twinkle in his eye and an easy, confident posture. Alexander stood before it, his face a mask of such complex, warring emotions, love, anger, grief, resentment, that it made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. He reached out a hand as if to touch the painted canvas, then let it drop, clenching it into a fist at his side. He was a man at war with a ghost, and he was losing. One evening, about a week into her stay, Mrs. Croft asked her to fetch a book from the main library. "It's a collection of Scottish ballads," the housekeeper said. "His Grace's mother was fond of them. It should be on the third shelf in the east alcove." The main library was a vast, two-story room, a cathedral of books. It was after 10, and the room was empty, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. The air was cool and smelled of leather and dust. Eliza moved silently between the towering shelves, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick Persian carpet. She found the east alcove and ran her fingers along the spines of the books on the third shelf. She found the Book of Ballads, its leather cover worn smooth with use. As she pulled it from the shelf, another, smaller book that had been tucked behind it was dislodged and fell to the floor. She bent to pick it up. It was a slim volume of poetry, bound in faded blue leather. It fell open in her hands. Tucked inside was a folded piece of paper, a letter. Her heart began to beat faster. It was wrong to read it. It was a violation of privacy. But the book felt familiar, and a powerful, undeniable instinct told her this was no accident. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was her mother's. "My dearest A," it began. "The winter closes in, and I find my thoughts turning always northward. To you. I've been reading the verse you sent. Did you know that a starling, in the old language, is called a stare? It suits them. They watch the world with such bright, intelligent eyes. I feel like a starling sometimes, watching your world from a distance. You speak of your burden, of the weight of your name. But a name is only a vessel, my friend. It is the spirit you pour into it that gives it substance. Do not let the vessel become the man. Remember the boy who climbed the old oak at Ashworth, just to see the world from a different angle. That boy is still within you. Do not lose him. I hold your pledge, your falcon, close to my heart. It is my compass in the dark. Know that you are not alone in your gilded cage. My thoughts are with you, always. Yours, E." Eliza sank onto the small step-stool, the letter trembling in her hand. It was a letter from her mother to the old Duke. Not a love letter, not in the way the world would understand it. It was a letter between two souls who understood each other perfectly. "My dearest A. Alexander." The old Duke's name had been Alexander too. The current Duke was Alexander II. This letter was the missing piece. It was the context for the ring. It spoke of their bond, of his burdens, of her quiet support. It was proof that their relationship was exactly as her mother had described it, a deep, private friendship that sustained them both. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. She took the book of ballads and returned to the housekeeper's room, her mind racing. This changed things. She could no longer simply wait for the Duke to see her. He was too blind, too locked in his narrative of fraud and deceit. She had to force him to see. She had to present him with the truth, not just the symbol of it, but the story behind it. She would request another audience, and this time she would not be dismissed. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The next morning, Eliza rose with a new sense of purpose. The grey light of dawn filled her small room, and for the first time, it did not feel like the light of a prison, but the light of a battlefield. Today, she would act. After her morning duties, she approached Mrs. Croft. "I must speak with the Duke again," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The housekeeper looked at her, sensing the shift. "He does not like to be disturbed, Eliza. He is meeting with his cousin this morning." Mr. Thorne was here, the man who had poisoned her name before she had even arrived. A cold dread mingled with her resolve. This made it more dangerous, but also more necessary. "It is a matter of the utmost urgency," Eliza said. "Please, Mrs. Croft, tell him I have found something that belonged to his father, something he will want to see." Mrs. Croft hesitated, then nodded. "I will tell him, but I can make no promises." Eliza spent the next hour in a state of suspended animation. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, the letter a small, solid weight in her pocket. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would present the letter, and then, finally, the ring. She would not be emotional. She would be factual, precise, and unwavering. Just before noon, there was a knock on her door. It was one of the footmen. "His Grace will see you, in the main library, now." Her heart leapt into her throat. She stood, smoothed her simple dress, and checked that her glove was secure. Then she followed the footman down the winding stairs and through the silent, carpeted corridors. The main library was brighter than it had been the night before, the tall windows flooding the room with pale winter light. The Duke was not alone. He stood by the fireplace, and beside him, lounging in a leather armchair, was another man. He was handsome in a way the Duke was not, charming where the Duke was severe, smiling where the Duke was grim. He had fair hair and a quick, intelligent face. He was dressed in the height of London fashion, his cravat an intricate masterpiece. This had to be Mr. Julian Thorne. As Eliza entered, Julian's eyes swept over her, a flicker of amusement in their depths. It was the look of a man who believed he had already won. "Ah," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk. "This must be the famous Miss Vance. My cousin has told me all about you. A most enterprising young woman." The insult was veiled, but it landed with precision. Alexander did not look at her. He addressed the fireplace. "Miss Vance, you claim to have found something of my father's." "I have, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. She refused to be intimidated by Julian's presence. In fact, his being here clarified things. She was not just fighting the Duke's grief, she was fighting this man's ambition. "Well," the Duke said impatiently, "what is it?" "It is a private matter, Your Grace," she said, her gaze fixed on him. "I would prefer to discuss it with you alone." Julian laughed, a light, condescending sound. "My dear Miss Vance, I am family. The Duke has no secrets from me, especially where his late father's entanglements are concerned. I assure you, I have heard far more scandalous tales than any you could invent." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Show me what you have found, Miss Vance." There was no way around it. She would have to do this in front of him. Perhaps it was for the best. Let the snake see the proof of his own lies. She took a breath. "Last night, in this room, I found a book. Inside it was this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded letter. She held it out. For a moment, no one moved. Julian's smile faltered. Alexander finally turned his head and looked at the piece of paper in her hand. "A letter," Julian scoffed. "How wonderfully original. Let me guess. It professes my late uncle's undying devotion and promises you the family silver." "It is a letter from my mother to the late Duke," Eliza said, ignoring him and speaking directly to Alexander. "I believe you will recognize her handwriting and his initial." Alexander hesitated, then strode forward and took the letter from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, impersonal contact, yet it sent a strange jolt through her. He unfolded it, his cold grey eyes scanning the familiar script. Eliza watched his face. She saw the flicker of recognition, the slight furrow of his brow as he read. She saw the moment he registered the words, "My dearest A," and the closing, "Yours E." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Julian had risen from his chair and stood beside his cousin, trying to read the letter over his shoulder. "What is it?" Julian asked, his voice tight. Alexander did not answer. He read the letter a second time, more slowly. She saw the rigid control in his posture begin to waver. The words on the page were a direct contradiction to the narrative he had been fed. This was not the letter of a grasping opportunist. It was the letter of an intellectual equal, a confidant, a friend. "Remember the boy who climbed the old oak?" "Where did you find this?" Alexander asked, his voice low, strained. "Tucked inside a book of poetry, on the shelf in the east alcove," Eliza replied. "A convenient discovery," Julian sneered, recovering his composure. "A simple forgery, no doubt. It would not be difficult for a clever woman to imitate my uncle's initial and invent a plausible story." "The ink is old," Alexander said, his gaze fixed on the paper. "And the handwriting. I have seen it before, on notes my father kept, notes about botany." He looked up at Eliza then, and for the first time he truly saw her. He was not looking at a category, petitioner, fraud, but at the woman standing before him. He saw the quiet certainty in her eyes, the lack of fear. He saw a person who was not trying to convince him, but was simply presenting him with a truth he could either accept or reject. "This is not proof of anything," Julian said quickly. "It's a sentimental note. It proves a friendship, perhaps. It does not prove a claim on the estate." "My mother did not make a claim on the estate," Eliza said, her voice ringing with clarity in the silent room. "She asked for the fulfillment of a pledge of sanctuary." Alexander looked from the letter to her face, his own face a mask of confusion and dawning doubt. A pledge? What pledge? This was the moment, the culmination of her long journey, of her humiliation, of her patient waiting. She stood a little straighter. "Your father gave my mother a symbol of his promise," she said, her voice low and clear. "A sign of his unbreakable word. He told her that as long as it existed, his pledge would hold." Slowly, deliberately, she began to pull off her right glove. Julian took a step forward. "What is this? More theatrics?" Alexander held up a hand, silencing him without a word. His eyes were locked on her hand. The worn leather slid from her fingers, from her palm, from her wrist. She let the glove fall to the floor, and she held up her hand. The firelight caught the gold of the ring, the dark, polished surface of the onyx. It gleamed on her finger, a solid, undeniable fact in the silent room. Alexander stared at it. His face, which had been a mask of cold control, seemed to crumble. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale as ash. He looked from the ring on her finger to the identical, larger one on his own hand. The Duke's signet. The symbol of his name, his power, his very identity. And she wore its twin. "No," he whispered. The word was not a denial. It was a sound of pure shock, of a world tilting on its axis. Julian stared at the ring, his mouth slightly agape, his carefully constructed nonchalance shattered. "What? What is that? Where did you get that?" "It was his father's pledge," Eliza said softly, looking only at Alexander. Alexander raised his eyes from the ring to her face. The coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, devastating understanding. He was seeing it all now. The years of his father's secret friendship, the depth of the bond that would warrant such a gift, the meaning of the pledge. This ring was not given to a mistress. It was given to someone held in the highest esteem, someone who was family in all but name. and he had sent the keeper of that pledge to the servants' entrance. He had called her a fraud. He had housed her in the attic and treated her with contempt. The full weight of his misjudgment, of his blind, arrogant cruelty, crashed down upon him. It was visible on his face, a wave of self-loathing so profound it was painful to witness. "You," he said, his voice choked. "You are—" "I am Eliza Vance," she said simply. "My mother was Eleanor Vance, and your father was her dearest friend." Julian, finally finding his voice, scrambled to recover. "It's a fake, a copy. It must be. Alex, don't be a fool. She's had it made. It's the final piece of her deception." But his words had no force. They were the frantic buzzing of a fly against a window pane. The truth was in the room now, solid and immovable, embodied in the gold and onyx on Eliza's hand. Alexander knew it was not a copy. He knew it with an instinct that went deeper than logic. He could feel the ring's authenticity, its history, its power. He could feel the weight of his father's secret. He turned on Julian, and the look in his eyes was one Eliza had not seen before. It was a cold, quiet rage, all the more terrifying for its lack of heat. "You told me she was a ruthless fraud." "She is," Julian insisted, his voice rising in panic. "I have sources, I tell you. You told me my father's affairs were riddled with false claimants," Alexander continued, his voice dangerously low. "You told me to trust no one, to guard the estate against people like her. For your own good, to protect you." "To protect me?" Alexander gave a short, bitter laugh. "Or to protect yourself? To ensure that no one with a legitimate claim, a moral claim, could ever get close? To make sure that you remained my closest confidant, my heir presumptive?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and deadly as a shard of glass. Julian paled. "Alexander, that's absurd. I am your cousin. I have only ever acted in your best interest." "My father kept a private ledger," Alexander said, his voice like stone. "I found it last month. It details certain payments to a man in London for information, payments to suppress inquiries. The name on the receipts was yours, Julian." Julian's face collapsed. The charming mask fell away, revealing the raw fear and greed beneath. I was protecting the family name from scandal." "You were isolating me," Alexander said, the realization dawning with brutal clarity. "You used my grief. You fed my anger and my suspicion, turning me into a tyrant in my own home. You built a wall around me, and you told me it was for my own safety." He looked at Eliza, at her calm, dignified face, at the ring on her hand. "And all the while the one person who held a piece of my father's true heart was standing on my doorstep, and I sent her to the kitchens." The shame in his voice was absolute. He turned his back on Julian, a complete and final dismissal. "Get out," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Alex, please! Get out of my house," Alexander repeated, his voice rising to a roar that shook the room. "And do not ever return." Julian flinched as if struck. He gave Eliza a look of pure, venomous hatred, then turned and fled the room, his flight a confession in itself. The library was silent again. The fire had burned low. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light. It was just the two of them. Alexander stood in the middle of the room, his shoulders slumped. He looked utterly broken. The rigid fortress of his grief and duty had been smashed to pieces, and he was left standing in the ruins. He did not look at her. He looked at the floor. "I have no words," he said, his voice hoarse. "There are no words to express the magnitude of my error, the depth of my shame." Eliza did not speak. She simply stood, her hand with the ring held loosely at her side. She had won. She had reclaimed her mother's honor and her own place, but there was no triumph in it. There was only a vast, aching sadness. Sadness for the years of her mother's secret loyalty. Sadness for the old Duke's lonely heart. And a strange, unexpected sadness for this broken man in front of her. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. The cold grey was now awash with a pain so raw it was difficult to look at. "Can you ever forgive me?" It was a question she had not expected. She had come seeking justice, not absolution. She had come for recognition, not for his soul. She thought of her first day, of the butler's sneer, of the long walk in the cold. She thought of his cold dismissal, his casual cruelty. and she thought of the man she had glimpsed behind the mask, the grieving son, the burdened duke, the man at war with a ghost. "There is nothing to forgive, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was softer than she intended. "You were grieving, and you were deceived. You did not act out of malice. You acted out of pain." He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-recrimination. "Pain is not an excuse for cruelty. I dishonored you. I dishonored my father's memory. I dishonored the very pledge he held so sacred." He took a hesitant step toward her, then another. He stopped just before her, his gaze fixed on the ring. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, holding out her hand. He did not take it. He simply looked at the ring, then at her face. "My father was a complicated man. I loved him, but I spent my life seeing his flaws, his carelessness, his extravagance. I never understood." He trailed off, his throat working. "I never understood the depth of his heart. I never knew he had a friend like your mother. I see now that his expansive feelings were not a weakness. They were his greatest strength, a strength I do not possess." "You possess a different kind," Eliza said quietly. "You possess the strength of duty, of order. You tried to protect his legacy, even if you misunderstood it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. "A misplaced duty, a destructive order." He finally reached out and gently took her hand in his. His touch was warm, hesitant. He traced the outline of the falcon on the ring with his thumb. "This ring. There has only ever been one other like it. It was made for my grandmother, the first Duchess of this line. When she died, my grandfather had it sealed in the family vault. My father must have retrieved it. To give this to your mother, it was the highest honor he could bestow. It meant he considered her family, his true family." The weight of that statement settled between them. He was still holding her hand. He did not seem to know how to let it go. "Miss Vance, Eliza, you said you came here seeking a home, a sanctuary." He looked around the vast, silent library, at the portraits of his ancestors, at the cold stone walls. "This house has not been a home for a very long time. It has been a mausoleum, a monument to duty and grief." He met her eyes, and his were filled with a desperate, dawning hope. Perhaps you could be the one to teach it how to be a home again." It was not a proposal. It was a plea for help, a plea for a new beginning. Eliza looked at their joined hands, his large and strong, marked by the signet of his power, hers smaller, more slender, marked by the signet of his father's secret heart. They were two halves of a single story, a story of loss, of misunderstanding, and now, perhaps, of redemption. "I believe," she said softly. "That is what my mother would have wanted." He did not let go of her hand. He simply stood there, holding it, as if it were a lifeline. And in the great silent library of Stonefell, with the ghosts of the past finally settling around them, the long, cold winter began at last to thaw. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. Eliza was moved from her attic room to a sun-filled suite in the East Wing, a suite that had belonged to Alexander's mother. Mrs. Croft oversaw the move with a quiet, satisfied smile. The staff, taking their cue from the Duke's radically altered behavior, now treated Eliza with a profound, almost reverential respect. The woman who had arrived at the servants' entrance was now the undisputed First Lady of the house, though her official title remained undefined. Alexander did not press her. He gave her space, time. He was a man unlearning a lifetime of rigid control, and the process was awkward and halting. He would ask her opinion on estate matters, a dispute with a tenant, a plan to repair the West Wing roof, and he would listen, truly listen, to her response. He started joining her and Mrs. Croft for dinner, not in the cavernous main dining hall, but in the housekeeper's cozy sitting room. The first time he did so, he seemed as nervous as a schoolboy. The long, cold dining table, which could seat 40, remained unused. At Eliza's suggestion, they took their meals in a small breakfast parlor that overlooked the gardens. The change was transformative. The cavernous silence of the great house began to be filled with the small sounds of life, conversation, the clink of silverware, the occasional hesitant sound of Alexander's laughter. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. He began to talk about his father, not with bitterness, but with a new, questioning curiosity. Eliza, drawing on the stories her mother had told her, filled in the gaps. She told him of the old Duke's passion for botany, his secret sponsorship of a young poet, his long walks on the moors, where he felt most himself. She painted a portrait of a man who was more than the sum of his debts and indiscretions. She gave Alexander back a version of his father he could love without reservation. In return, he showed her the soul of the estate. He took her riding across the moors, pointing out the places his father had loved. He showed her the hidden, walled garden his mother had cultivated, now overgrown and neglected. Together, they began to work in it, clearing the weeds, pruning the roses, bringing it back to life. In these quiet, shared moments, a new bond was forged between them, one built not on the past, but on the present. He never spoke of Julian Thorne. The man had vanished from their lives as if he had never been, but his absence was a constant, unspoken presence, a reminder of the deception that had almost cost them everything. One afternoon they were in the library, cataloguing the old Duke's collection of botanical prints. Alexander was quiet, his focus intense. "I want to apologize again," he said suddenly, not looking up from a delicate drawing of a wild orchid. Eliza stopped what she was doing. "Alexander, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he insisted, finally meeting her eyes. His were clear and direct. "I apologize, not just for what I did, but for what I was. I was a man so encased in pride and grief that I was blind. I looked at you and I saw only what I expected to see. A threat, a problem. I never saw you." He reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the ring. He traced the falcon with his thumb, a gesture that had become familiar and dear. "You have a gift, Eliza. A gift of quiet dignity. You came to my house and endured the worst insult I could offer, and you did not break. You did not rail. You simply waited. You waited for me to be capable of seeing the truth. You gave me the space to find my own way out of the darkness." "I saw the good in you," she said softly. "Even then, I saw a man who was lost, not a man who was cruel." "You saw what I could not see in myself," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have brought this house, and its master, back to life. You have fulfilled your mother's promise, and in doing so, you have saved me." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to the signet ring. It was a kiss that sealed a new pledge, not one of duty or inheritance, but one of love. A love that had grown quietly, in the spaces between words, in shared work and patient understanding. "Eliza Vance," he said, his voice low and certain. "Will you marry me? Will you be the Duchess of Northwood, not by right of a hidden pledge, but by my choice? By my heart?" Tears welled in her eyes, the tears she had refused to shed on her first day. But these were not tears of shame or anger. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alexander." Epilogue 1 year later. The summer sun streamed through the windows of the breakfast parlor, illuminating the gleam of polished silver and the vibrant colors of the flowers from the now thriving walled garden. Stonefell was a different house. The grey stone seemed to have absorbed the warmth from within, and the halls that had once echoed with silence now held the murmur of a happy, bustling household. Eliza, now the Duchess of Northwood, poured tea. She wore a simple morning dress of pale blue, but on her right hand, the falcon ring still gleamed. It was a permanent part of her, a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. On her left hand, a diamond band sat beside it, a symbol of the future. Alexander entered the room, and the change in him was remarkable. The harsh lines of grief had softened. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a warm, steady light, a light that was reserved only for her. He had learned to smile, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. He came to stand behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Good morning, Your Grace," he murmured, his lips brushing her hair. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied, tilting her head back to look at him. Their life was quiet, but it was full. They had found their rhythm in the running of the estate, in their long walks, in their evenings spent reading by the fire. The ghosts of the past had not vanished entirely. There was still a bittersweet ache when she thought of her mother, a shadow of sadness for the lonely life the old Duke had led. The memory of her first day, of the butler's disdain and the walk to the servants' entrance, was a scar that had healed but would always remain. But it was a scar that had bound them together. It was a shared memory of a profound mistake and an even more profound forgiveness. It had taught them the value of looking closer, of listening harder, of choosing kindness over pride. Their love was not a fairy tale of instant passion, but a slow, deliberate construction, built plank by plank, stone by stone, like the house itself. It was stronger for it. Alexander's hands tightened gently on her shoulders. "I was in the village yesterday," he said. "Old Thomas, the gardener, stopped me. He said he remembered your mother. He said she had the same quiet way about her, the same eyes." Eliza smiled, a soft, wistful expression. "I'm glad someone here remembers her." "We all do now," Alexander said. "You have brought her story into the light." He moved around the table and sat opposite her. He picked up his cup, but his eyes were on her. "I often think about that first day." "Do you?" she asked, her gaze steady. "I do," he said. "I think about the man I was, the blind, arrogant fool who stood in the library and passed judgment on a woman he knew nothing about." "That man is gone," she said softly. "He is," Alexander agreed. "You banished him. You and your quiet dignity." He reached across the table, taking her hand, the one with the ring. He brought it to his lips, just as he had done a year before. The gesture was no longer a plea, but a promise. A promise renewed every day. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. She did not need to ask what he was thanking her for. He was thanking her for everything, for seeing him, for waiting for him, for teaching a house made of stone and a man made of ice how to feel the warmth of the sun again. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.